morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops session. We'd like to really thank our sponsors for this session. It's the Minnesota Soybean and Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Councils. Today we have three guests joining us. We have Bruce Potter. He's an extension IPM specialist, and he's stationed down at the Southwest Research and Outreach Center in Lamberton. We have Dr. Ian MacRae. He is an extension entomologist, and he's stationed at the Northwest Research and Outreach Center in Crookston. And then we have Dr. Seth Nave. He is the soybean agronomist for extension, and he's stationed on the St. Paul campus. I'll be your moderator here today. My name's Angie Peltier, and I'm stationed up in Crookston, sort of down the road from Ian. With that, we'll start our discussion. So if gentlemen, if any of you have any opening words, otherwise we'll just go ahead and get started with some of our questions.
Well, I think we can just start the discussion. I mean, if we have basically knowing what insects are going to do in reaction to drought is a lot easier to predict than predicting the drought itself. So maybe we can touch on some of those things today.
You bet. Yes, that sounds great. So basically, one of the questions that we have, we know that in drought conditions, we have our soybean crop, for example, might be a better source of food for two-spotted spider mites or other insect pests, for example. And maybe before we get to talking about the insect pests, maybe we can talk a little bit about what happens to the plant sap and other materials in that plant due to drought.
Yeah, I'll take that on first. Yeah, I think just a little bit of background on drought, stress, and soybeans especially. I think it's important to kind of contextualize this kind of in what's going on, because most of us go out to the field and we see soybean leaves flipping over, showing the undersides of the leaves, corn leaves rolling up in the afternoon. And then later on, we kind of see the soybeans of the corn crop kind of stunted and smaller. And these are kind of the first visual observations we make of drought after the fact that we're not cutting our grass in our lawns and things like that. But there's a lot going on before that. And so I think it's kind of important to kind of think about that first and think about what's happening, for the plant and in the soil. First of all, there's kind of a temporal difference. And I guess that's really obvious for us to see the leaves rolling in the afternoon or tipping over in the afternoon. So we know that something is different happening later in the day. And that's simply the soybean or the corn plants are running out of water, available water relative to their usage rate. So as it gets warm, we have more evaporation from the soil, more transpiration from the leaves themselves. So that ET, that rate of water loss from the system, really ramps up towards the afternoon, and it exceeds what the plant can take up. And that's when we start to see those symptoms. But even at the beginning sides of this kind of drought stress, we're seeing the same types of things. The plant is seeing those same types of things. It's having more trouble accessing water later in the afternoon, and especially on hotter days and on drier days, or lower relative humidities, days with more wind. So strategically, what the plant's doing is it's basically exploring more of the soil as it becomes drier, and it's not roots are not searching out water. It's just that they're actually growing better where there is water. So it's kind of a fallacy that these soybean leaves somehow know, or soybean roots somehow know that there's water down there. They're just growing, and where there's abundant water, they're growing at a much faster rate, or they're even stopped where there isn't water. And then after that, the soybean plant itself starts to kind of regulate itself. If it's not able to kind of keep up during the day, then it's changing its kind of makeup of that solutes and the dissolves solution within the leaves to kind of concentrate itself, and that allows through osmosis more water basically to come into those leaves. So the plant's doing a whole bunch of stuff before we ever really see anything happen in the field. Then we start to see this kind of leaf tipping, showing the undersides of the leaves. Then we see leaf expansion slow. And eventually then we'll start to see loss of photosynthesis in the afternoon. And that's when we kind of have our first real yield hit relative to the yield potential, is when we start to see actual photosynthesis shut down in the afternoon. So there's a lot going on from the soybean plant, but then those insects are probably sensing a lot of this as well. So, we can talk about the kind of environmental side on the insects, but from the plant side, I think probably some of those first things that they're either seeing or sensing are kind of the changes in the solute concentrations, kind of the bulking up of sugars or amino acids in the leaves and stems to allow that plant to continue to take up water. And then from a visual standpoint, you can imagine that there's some of these insects like aphids that might see something different in those soybean fields that have a lighter leaf underneath turned up too. So the entomologist can talk more on those sides. But I just want to kind of give you an overview of what that soybean plant is doing as it kind of starts in through this transition of drought stress over time.
So entomologists, would you like to expand on Seth's discussion here?
Yeah, as Seth had said, there's going to be definite changes to there's a couple of other things that are playing into drought, that it's not just there's a lot of resource availability impacts, as Seth had said, and it's going to impact how rapidly and how large an insect population will grow. But associated with drought generally are higher temperatures, and that's just as important. The higher the temperature, insects are cold-blooded, so all of their physiological processes are driven by ambient temperature. The warmer it is, generally the faster the physiological processes will run. And so sometimes you will get, except in really severe droughts where water becomes limiting, oftentimes those higher temperatures will result in shorter generation time. So in things like aphids and spider mites, you see more rapidly developing populations. And oftentimes if there's enough resources to not impart a lot of mortality, then you're going to see a growing population very rapidly in response to that heat. It also generally means that you're going to see a little bit more oviposition. Or more egg laying. They're going to be developing more eggs. So they're just going to be everything's going to be ramped up a little bit with regard to behavior and physiology. As Seth had said, that definitely the plant status is going to, the food status is going to impact how much of that is going to be translated into population growth. Also, as I think Bruce is probably going to talk about as well, there's a lot of biocontrol issues that happen as well. The impacts of drought on the growth of, say, animal, fungal diseases that control insect populations. And of course, that's cut down, which means you have a larger starting population. So the whole thing just gets rolling really quick. So one of the things that gets kind of really throws us off when we're doing insect control in those kind of dry, hot conditions is how rapidly those populations grow. And it's a combination of factors that are leading to that. So, and it's also fairly, you're going to see certain species that are going to be really affected, positively affected by drought. You're going to see larger populations, things like aphids, things like spider mites, grasshoppers. We saw huge, grasshopper populations in much of the western part of the state this year. And with some of those species, that's going to be building. If we see dry years this upcoming year, for example, grasshopper populations are probably going to be higher. But a lot of our aphid populations, some of them overwinter here, some of them are coming from somewhere else. So it's going to be an interesting year.
I think Seth brought up a good point on root development. And if there's a lack of moisture, you don't have the same rate of root development. And that can impact things that are injuring crop roots. Corn rootworm are an example. And especially if it's hot and dry, then you sometimes have problems with those brace roots actually getting forming and getting into the soil. So you've got a certain amount of rootworm pressure, insect pressure, and then that moisture stress kind of aggravates that, because you're not producing the root mass to spread that injury out over. Another example, it's not an insect, but soybean cyst nematode are kind of the same way. If you have droughty conditions and you have problems with uptake of water, then that nematode injury or feeding on those root systems is actually more pronounced than it is in a wetter year. So you can have things happening below ground, and then that's affecting things above ground. For example, if you've got soybean cyst nematode underneath that plant, you're actually, even though it may not be as dry, you're creating more of a drought stress situation, and you're aggravating things like two-spotted spider mite in that field. So it's what's happening below ground, what's happening above ground, and everything's kind of all relating. And the longer and the hotter it is, the more one organism versus another is going to take control. I think if you look at just the soybean system, if you've got a little bit of moisture stress, that kind of favors soybean aphids. But if that moisture stress gets too pronounced, and it's not just aphids in general, then that host plant probably is not as suitable for the insects. But it becomes more suitable for something like a spider mite, and you've got competition between the different pest species as well. So you might start out with a soybean aphid problem and it transitions into spider mites later on. And just my experience, spider mites usually win.
So sticking with the spider mite topic, what I observed in some fields this past growing season was that, people often think of them coming in from the outer edges of the field and then moving towards the middle. It seemed that some of the most severe injury symptoms were often areas of the field where plants were stressed due to other things like compaction, for example. Would you mind talking about how stresses can compound insect injury or insect population increases over time?
Well, if you're in your compaction example, Angie, you can actually create a drought with plenty of moisture if you've got compaction and poor root development or poor root function. Spider mites, at least two-spotted spider mites in soybeans, they tend to do better as those plants reach the reproductive stage. And once those plants are reproductive and you got hot, dry weather, that's when things really take off. And I'm assuming there's some kind of physiological change in the soybean or something, some nutrient difference in those plants that those mites are sensing at that time. But maybe Seth, you could address that. I'm not a good enough soybean physiologist to answer.
And I actually don't think it's really well known or well characterized. I guess I don't, from my standpoint, I don't know. The entomologists probably have better ideas. Certain entomologists probably have better idea about the actual nutrition requirements and how those change, but it's not even from the soybean physiology side. I don't think we have it very well. It isn't very well known. So there was a question in the chat from Daryl Ike that actually kind of follows up on your first part of this, Bruce. He asks about pre-plant tillage and the effect on this whole question. And he asks it from a very academic standpoint. He basically is asking about the water loss directly, as well as, the changes in the soil, the physical characteristics that might affect water holding capacity and root growth and things like that. And that's exactly the right question to ask, because I think a lot of us think about tillage as using up a lot of water and just kind of turning over that soil and opening the soil up for evaporation, and that there's evaporative losses. But there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on related to that soil profile as well in terms of water holding capacity. And I'm not a soils expert, and it's certainly not on the physical side very knowledgeable on it. But I think most of us could imagine both sets of situations where tillage can open things up and allow for a greater water holding capacity. And we can also imagine times when we create more compaction, especially in certain zones with tillage that impede that root growth or impede water infiltration. A number of different things. So there's a lot going on down there, and I think those are all really good questions, and probably something that we need, some more help with some of the soils folks for some of those answers. But then that brings up another question that kind of circled around earlier that Bruce was talking about root development, and I mentioned root profile, and I think that's another important aspect of this is the soil profile. There's a physical zone or a strata where we have stuff going on, and we might have insect species confined to a certain area. We might have things like SCN, and then we have root growth, and we've got water, and we've got nutrient availability, all kind of stratified in that soil. And so it's very complex to kind of know where all of this is happening. And sometimes our roots we kind of talk about it growing out of the zone where we have nutrients, but they're also probably growing out of some of these zones where they've got disease or insect pressure as well. So you could imagine, or as Bruce mentioned with brace roots, the corn roots can't grow through that zone where we have those insects gnawing away at the roots. So very complicated stuff, and I think that's probably why we don't see consistent responses, and why it's not easy to just give really flat answers for a lot of this stuff. Mm-hmm. Plus it's roots, so nobody's out there digging roots in all these fields all the time. It's truly the hidden half for a reason. It's just too much work.
There was a question regarding optimal temperatures with insect growth. I'll take a moment to answer that. Yeah, there are optimal temperatures for insect growth. I mean, it is ambient temperature, but there's going to be an upper threshold and lower thresholds within which they're going to have, their greatest potential for development. Interestingly enough, it's going to vary species to species. But interestingly enough, when you look at the vast majority of plant pests, their optimal temperature in both lower and upper are wider generally than the plants that they exploit. And it kind of makes sense as to, it's one of the reasons why their pests are able to exploit the plant in a wide variety of conditions. But yes, to the answer to that question, yes, there are optimal temperatures, but we're unlikely to go, too much above them. They will kind of you'll start to see reproduction slow down at certain temperatures, like aphids will they'll start to reproduce a little less when you start getting into the 90s. But generally speaking, they're still functional as plant pests and over a broader range than temperatures that will affect the plant.
Ian, how does relative humidity interact with temperature on the insects specifically? And I think we could probably get around to the disease side and fungi and things like that. But what about relative humidity impacts on insects specifically?
Yeah, it varies by species. Some species like spider mites actually prefer, their reproductive potential will actually increase as it gets drier. We used to keep, when I was doing my doctorate, we had a lot of mite colonies because we were studying predaceous mites. And yeah, we used to keep those rooms fairly dry. It was important to keep the humidity down if you were going to have high populations. And so they're a species that does extremely well when it gets dry. It favors their reproduction. Aphids will do a little better when it's drier, but that probably is more a reflection of what the humidity is doing to the natural controls than to their actual reproduction and to their biological potential.
So you mentioned this earlier, I think, Ian, and Bruce, be sure and chime in here as well. But if weather does remain dry, what what can we expect in addition to spider mites? And maybe just to set the stage, in the Crookston area last fall, not last fall, but in 2020, we ended up with a very, very dry fall going into winter, and that might have impacted some of the insects we were battling up at least in Northwest Minnesota, just this past growing season.
Grasshoppers, lots and lots of grasshoppers. Typically for grasshoppers, typically a warm, dry fall followed by a dry spring is what contributes to those populations building. And grasshoppers with only one generation a year are going to, they're a species that has building years until you finally, those large outbreaks usually are preceded by years where you see those populations increasing. You have increasing problems kind of managing grasshoppers in fields. If we have another warm, dry spring, we're going to have a lot of grasshoppers. There was an awful lot of them out, certainly in the Northwest and into Northeast North Dakota. There were a lot of grasshoppers that were laying eggs. I like to go out in the fall and kind of monitor out in the production areas, which are in the ditches and roadways and things like that outside the fields. And there was a lot of egg laying activity going on. So there's a lot of eggs out there. We've got good snow cover, so they're not, they're also deep enough in the soil. They're not going to be really affected by the low temperatures we've had this winter. And if we have a dry spring, we're going to have a successful hatch. So we'll see high grasshopper populations. With aphids, it's not just soybean aphid, but we saw small grain aphids in the later season. A lot of those are migrants that come up from southern states and become established. So the drought effects on their populations are going to be more related to those fungal pathogens that kind of cap their early season growth. So if we have another dry year, we'll probably start to see more cereal aphids. If we certainly get the immigration, well, we'll see higher cereal aphid populations, and spider mites, obviously, as you had mentioned. So what do you think about soybean aphid? Bruce, you do an awful lot more on overwintering than I do.
Well, I mean, we've had some cold temperatures, so that I don't know if that's enough to knock them back completely in the south, maybe a little bit more in the north. And wild aphids tend to be a little more tough than the tame ones we have in labs where we do the studies.
Yeah, that's true.
But I think aphids' success basically depends on first off, how many are going over to buckthorn in the fall and what success they have there. In Southwest Minnesota for the past couple of years, it's kind of unusual. We're not finding any at all on buckthorn, and previously, every fall you can go out and readily find aphids on buckthorn. So maybe the populations are a bit down, but really I think what drives it is what kind of weather they have in the spring when they're coming over to soybeans. If their soybeans are available, what size of the soybeans are with respect to that aphid movement, and then what kind of weather we have in the spring. I think what really hurt those populations last year in the south is about the time those aphids were moving from buckthorn into soybeans. We had those horribly hot, dry, windy days, and the soybeans were real small. That's not much protection. Seth mentioned those leaves flipping up when you have drought stress, and that's where those aphids are trying to survive. And there's a small canopy; they can't get further down in the canopy to protect themselves. So I guess it's good. I think we're going to take a wait and see attitude on aphids, and usually by June we have a pretty good idea of how well that movement to soybean is happening. Spider mites is right now they should be wintering on perennial vegetation on the edge of the fields, and then they'll move into crops during the spring. And I think the good news is, at least in the south where we had some high humidity, even though we didn't have rain and that drought persisted, we had some high humidity days, and the neozygotes fungi really kicked in and knocked a lot of these populations out. So the optimistic part of me thinks that maybe we've got a buildup of those pathogens in the system now that's going to make it a little bit more tough for those mites to flourish in the spring. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Thanks. So one of the issues that I know people are concerned about, we had discussions about this during our recent pesticide applicator training events, is the loss of Chlorpyrifos from our toolbox. And so I'd like to bring in, for a moment here, we have a guest from, he's from, let's see, US EPA. He works with the pesticide division down in Chicago. His name is Seth Dibley, and he can just share with us what happened on the 28th of February and what that means going forward here. And then maybe when we are done hearing from Seth Dibley, the rest of us can kind of discuss what that means for pesticides and effective pesticides with some of our insects going forward in 2022.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to speak a little bit. What happened on Monday was that the tolerances for Chlorpyrifos on food and feed crops were revoked in final form. And that means that crops in commerce can no longer have residues of Chlorpyrifos. And that pertains again to food and feed crops. That was proposed in October. There was a 120-day period to entertain objections. EPA did entertain a number of objections, but the process was actually driven by a court decision earlier this year about our ability to safely regulate Chlorpyrifos. And Chlorpyrifos has a long regulatory history that I don't need to elaborate. But here is the twist. Typically, when we can no longer use a product like Chlorpyrifos, we will cancel the uses first. We will let legally treated food and feed make their way through commerce with tolerances intact, and then eventually we will revoke the tolerances. Because of the court decision, that process went backwards. We revoked the tolerances first, and now we are looking at canceling the uses under FIFRA. And that puts people in a bind, because it's possible now that there are treated commodities, the legally treated commodities that are still in commerce that have what is now an illegal residue. And that's a bind we like to avoid if we can, but again, this was driven by a court decision. So the Food and Drug Administration has just issued guidance about products in commerce that have illegal residues of legally treated crops. And there is a fairly lengthy procedure by which those crops are evaluated. There's also been recently filed a lawsuit against EPA on the part of industry, actually asking us to either stay that decision or to remand that decision. We'll have to wait on the outcome of that lawsuit to be sure. So everything in that regard is kind of up in the air. So the take-home message right now is that indeed you are unable to use Chlorpyrifos in this season on food and feed crops, because you will be at risk for adulterating your crop, and that won't change unless a court otherwise, orders otherwise. But there is guidance out there for your treated crops, and there's also some some instructions and guidance being developed for registrants and canceling their food and feed uses of Chlorpyrifos. It's been a bit of a can of worms, but we are making our way through.
Well, thank you, Seth. If you wouldn't mind putting a link to that guidance in our chat here, I think we're going to move on to what this means for us and our ability to control some of our insect pests going into 2022. What do we have that's left for some of our more difficult to manage insect pests, and anybody is Bruce or Seth, Nave or Ian, you're welcome to comment now.
Well, Ian, you want to handle that, or? I mean, we can still control insects. Corn and soybeans aren't probably as big a deal as some of the other crops.
Mhm.
Sugar beets are a little bit more at risk. And then there's other crops where there's certain pests that Chlorpyrifos is probably the only, not so much in Minnesota, but Chlorpyrifos is the insecticide of choice that are going to be a bigger bind.
Yeah, certainly we've come to rely on Chlorpyrifos for a number of recent resistance issues in a lot of the commoner insects like soybean aphid and spider mites. There are other products out there that will work. I mean, there's some very, very effective aphids for soybean aphid. They're newer products and they're going to cost more than generic products did, but they're very effective. In sugar beets, yes, Chlorpyrifos is going to be a big hit. I know we're looking at other products right now. I know Mark Botel down at DSU is doing an awful lot of work on looking at products that might cover for Chlorpyrifos. That's typically an adult, treatment for adults right around oviposition time in response to state counts, sticky state counts. But there are other products that will work fairly well, and he's identified a couple of them. Nail It is one of them. It's an older product, but it is very effective against flies, and so he's had some luck in trials with those. And there's a number of other products that he's looking at as well. We've come to rely on this product for a number of systems. And there are things that will kind of fill in that need. Some of them are going to take a little bit more research, especially things like sugar beet, fruit maggot, looking at those adult treatments. But I think right now his recommendation is Nail It, and some of the other products work fairly well, and that might be worth trying.
So what about spraying Chlorpyrifos on a non-food crop like perennial ryegrass used for seed production? Is that allowed? Does anybody know?
I would have to actually check on specific uses. They are evaluating all of these sort of hybrid. I mean, we had the same question about treating apple tree trunks in orchards. So there are some specific areas where it's not clear yet whether that use will be allowed, and there is guidance under development.
Okay, thank you. Another question just came in. So what about thresholds if you have more than one pest attacking your crop in let's say soybean or wheat? What about if on soybeans you have aphids, spider mites, thistle caterpillar, and grasshopper? That's the example that this attendee put down in the same soybean field. Do you adjust your threshold, treatment threshold to deal with the multiple pests, or how would you handle that?
If I had all those, I'd probably give up and go fishing. But I think it depends on the insect. So like I mentioned earlier, aphids and spider mites they're sort of antagonistic. So those spider mites are defoliating the upper part of the plant, and that's where the aphids are trying to do their feeding. So depending on the weather and what kind of beneficials there are out there, what kind of biocontrol organisms are working, one of those is going to usually win out. Defoliators, that's another situation. And for if you've got caterpillars feeding on a crop, and there's a defoliation threshold like there is for soybeans, it's grasshoppers and bean leaf beetles, for example. It's actually probably easier to just lump the defoliation all together and treat it as a group. So I think some of these newer chemicals that Ian mentioned, they're going to be more specific. Going to be more just for piercing insects with piercing sucking mouth parts like aphids and thrips, that sort of thing. You're going to have, after you treat, you're going to have some other insects left out there. And I think that's something that growers are just going to have to maybe get a little bit more used to. You got to figure out what your problem is, take care of that problem, and then worry about other things as they develop, if they develop later.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I didn't address that these newer products like Safina and Transform and Savanto Prime, these are very specific to piercing sucking insects, to aphids and leafhoppers and things like that. And consequently, yeah, if you do have a problem with aphids and you use one of those products and then you have a subsequent problem with grasshoppers, you're not going to get any coverage for grasshoppers with those products. And so, yeah, I think Bruce has got a very good point, is that there's, a lot of education that we're going to need to do on how to use some of these newer products. And, as we see product, as we see the toolbox change and we see pest populations change, we're going to start having to kind of mix and match some things.
So along those lines, guys, do we need to start thinking, does this really evoke more effort into an IPM type strategy for dealing with these things? So we're talking about potential fungi that are going to take out some of these species when we have wet cycles, things like that. Do we need to try to reduce some of our fungicide applications in order to maintain some of those? Do we need to watch some of our current applications of insecticides for managing predatory insects? I mean, does this really bring up some of these larger, more holistic ecological strategies over, or IPM related strategies over just these single use compounds? Do you think that helps support some of those if we're really going to start thinning down on the number of active ingredients we have to use?
Well, yeah, I would say probably. I mean, it's also very important to be aware of what the consequences of some of those are. And Seth, you'd mentioned it, fungicide applications. There's a lot of data to indicate you apply fungicide applications, you may very well have a subsequent outbreak of aphids or one of the other species. I mean, that's really well documented, and but it's not well known. It's a lot of publications on it, but sometimes you'll get a phone call of great surprise when, gosh, just had an aphid outbreak. What's going on? So yeah, some of that is there's an educational need. But yeah, I agree. I think we really kind of are, as our pest management tactics are going to change over the future, and as our available tactics and available tools are going to change over the future. Yeah, we need to start thinking about how we develop programs to manage our pests with the tools we have.
I would like to just contribute here. The state of California has banned Chlorpyrifos for quite some time, and the University of California, Davis has published a fairly robust guide to integrated pest management without Chlorpyrifos. For us, it does not include row crops very well. It's more oriented to specialty crops, which are, of course, a bigger chunk of the agricultural production in California. But it is, at least in my opinion, one notch more holistic than pest crop use.
You can make this non-holistic, and if you're using one of these like a Transform or a Safina or Savanto, that's targeting a specific group of insects, and you tank mix it because you don't want any other insects out there. So you might tank, and actually there's recently some tank mixes being marketed. Ridgeback, for example, is Transform plus bifenthrin, and you can do that. But the issue is that in Minnesota cropping systems, you're kind of negating some of the advantages of these newer insecticides, where you're not harming the beneficials and that sort of thing, and you're actually leaving some biocontrol in place after the insecticide wears out. You're getting rid of that. So you'd have to have a pretty special reason to to want to do something like that, I think. If aphids or mites are your main concern, and you're using miticide or one of these newer insecticides.
One question from Daryl in the chat about disposal for existing stocks of Chlorpyrifos. And this is another one of these artifacts related to the revocation of the tolerance before the cancellation of the use. And at this time, there is no provision for take back or for registrant-supported disposal of Chlorpyrifos stocks. And of course, there is no food or feed use permitted now. You would, if you did so now, you would be adulterating your crop. So at this time, the options are being negotiated with the registrants. We may see some registrants offering a take back program, but those are being negotiated now, and there's nothing in place now. However, every year, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture sponsors a used pesticide take-back program that will ensure proper disposal, and that would be your option for your existing Chlorpyrifos storage. And the important thing that has come out is that you really can't use your household hazardous waste programs for your Chlorpyrifos stocks. They are not prepared to take those, and that guidance has come out through the pesticide regulatory agencies. So I would keep an eye out for the pesticide disposal programs. Typically, they are in the late summer at several different places, sponsored by Department of Agriculture.
Okay, thank you. So with our high input prices, fertilizer prices, for example, especially for crops that need nitrogen, more people might be considering growing soybean after soybean. So, I mean, that creates a whole laundry list of potential problems. But from an insect management standpoint, are there any uncommon insect problems that would, the chances of that problem would increase when growing soybean after soybean?
But uncommon, but boy, the ones you do have will certainly be magnified.
Some of the grasshopper species might be
It's true.
in play here, like differential and red-legged grasshoppers.
Yeah,
Some of those
that's
are
true.
oviposit within soybeans, so you don't have to have them moving in from the field edge. They're already in the field. So guys are driving at high speed up and down the ditches and roadsides, and the problem's actually coming up in the middle of the field on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
Soybean gall midge, Bruce?
Possibly, I mean, because they don't have to actually go to another field. They're in that same field. In Nebraska, where they've got more problems with the insect than we do here in Minnesota. Just because you have soybeans on soybeans doesn't appear that your gall midge problem is always worse. So there may be some biocontrol things going on there, or something in that habitat that may not be as good as having the insects emerge out of corn, for example.
But I think it's just the classic example of risk benefit, risk avoidance, is that it just predisposes you to a greater risk. And soybean gall midge is a good example of, instead of confining it to a potential field edge, you're opening yourself up to a potential field-wide situation.
Sure.
If you had the right environment. I mean, it's possible. We haven't seen that, but you could imagine a situation where soybean gall midge could take over a whole field if you're following one. So, or it could disperse through the whole field somehow. So
That's a good point. They wouldn't have to move to find a host. It'd be right there where they're emerging from. So it's a good point. There's so many reasons not to do it besides insects that, if you get into the plant path area.
Right, exactly. So one other issue that we heard a lot about, it seemed almost season wide, was alfalfa weevil. Did that have anything to do with the drought, or what do you think was to blame for the alfalfa weevil issue in 2021?
I think the possible impact with drought might have been, and I don't know this for a fact, but we had a relatively mild winter, probably good survival, and of the adults that are overwinter. There's more than one biotype of alfalfa weevil, but if it's specifically related to drought, possibly adult alfalfa weevils, when they emerge during the summer, actually estivate for a period of time and aren't quit actively feeding, and then either, depending on the biotype, either start feeding a little bit they'll start feeding a little bit in the fall before they hibernate. But maybe that real dry weather put a halt in egg laying for a while and prolong that egg laying. That'd be the possible connection with drought. And like most insects, they're probably at a high point in their population dynamics. We're seeing a lot more bee and leaf beetles. At least we were. We'll see what this winter weather did to them. So the stuff that overwinter here tends to be cyclical. It may relate to moisture or heat, like grasshoppers. And then we've got a whole group of insects that are spending the winter down south, and how they do depends on what the weather is down south and what kind of weather systems bring them up, and then they have to interact with the climate here. So I don't know if I answered that or not. I don't know the actual reason, but I'm throwing hypotheses up against the wall. Maybe one of them will stick.
Sure. So when we think about dry weather, we often think about poor management with herbicides, for example. Is there any other similar situation that happens when it comes to insecticides and insects? Are they able to adapt in any way to better resist being affected by insecticides due to drought?
Efficacy changes, would you say, Ian? I can use the corn rootworm example, and we'll talk about that probably in more detail next week. But if you've got dry weather, and especially if you've got an insecticide that isn't very soluble, like a pyrethroid, it doesn't move around very much in the soil, and your control goes down. Ian, you want to talk about foliar applications?
Well, with the associated heat, with drought, certainly pyrethroid efficacy is going to start dropping when you get into the 90s. So we had calls this year questioning whether or not we were starting to see some resistance in grasshoppers with some of the pyrethroids, which are kind of one of the standard chemistries to use against grasshoppers. And it was a lot more related to the fact that the chemistry was going on when it was 95 degrees than the fact that we were seeing any resistance. Environmental conditions are really going to exacerbate pesticide efficacy. So,
sure.
Also, with increased drought, I think we probably would see a little bit in. There's a couple of different ways where your residual activity of insecticide is affected. Obviously, any precipitation is one of the big ones, but also volatilization. The chemistry will volatilize off a leaf if you're looking at a foliar application when you're talking about dry conditions and very low relative humidity. And that's also going to affect the relative humidity on the leaf. The plants are really going to start shutting down their stomata. So you have an increased volatilization of the insecticide that's on the leaf as well, which is going to cut down residual activity. So there's just so much going on there that it's going to start cutting back, whether those pesticides are going to be around for a long time.
And Ian, I think that's one of the reasons that guys for grasshoppers are one example, and they're not necessarily related to drought, although um, things like armyworms, but you're better off trying to get those populations determined early and treat those insects when they're small versus trying to kill them when they're, kill a large grasshopper, particularly if it's hot and dry out.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, most insects have a really well-developed enzyme system to break down toxins, and they will use it on insecticides as well. And the older the insect gets, the more well-developed that system is, because they're feeding on, as they feed, they're going to encounter toxins on the plant and in the plant, and so they have to break those down. And so their mixed function oxidase systems, those enzyme systems, really get cranked up the older they get. That's part of it. And yeah, delivering that insecticide for a long enough period of time at high enough rates where you're going to get into that mortality areas can be challenging with the older species. But yeah, Bruce is right. Younger insects are almost always easier to kill than older insects with insecticide. That's pretty much a given. So trying to control those populations earlier. And it also reflects what's happening with those fungal pathogens, the fungi that kill insects. They operate on the youngest species, the youngest stages most effectively, and consequently they're taking off that early part of the population and decreasing the growth on how many can actually, the starter of the population, if you want to put it that way, and it decreases how large that population gets. And that's one of the reasons why when it's not growing, when those fungi aren't available, and you start with a larger population, it's one of the major reasons why you see an outbreak related to drought.
And
Ian,
just
you and I have.
sorry, Bruce, just to state the obvious on this question about, impacts of, there's a physical effect too. I mean, we could potentially have much smaller canopies. So you may be, your spray patterns and how you're applying that to the leaf area may be really reduced on an acre basis if you're actually, because you're not, you may be losing some of it to the soil. And then there's also leaf angle, rolling of leaves in corn. You can have stratification of the insects within the canopy that would be different than it would be under normal situations. So some of those things play a role, and some probably benefit that application, and some probably more so probably reduce the efficacy.
Even more simply, a smaller number of insects can cause greater injury or greater physiological or yield loss effects on a small canopy than a large canopy. Ian, you and I have talked in the past about the relationship between heat and fast impact insect development, and then guys getting caught with populations that are a lot bigger than they thought than they were expecting, just because of that rapid development.
Yeah, that's a good point. As we'd said earlier, the hotter it is, generally speaking, the more reproduction is cranked up in an insect. And those generation times, especially on those pest species where you've got multiple generations in a year, aphids and many of the beetles and things like that, those generation periods start getting really, really short. And all of a sudden, what was small yesterday may not be small today, simply because they're growing so fast. And so that's the other thing that I would really stress about this upcoming year. If we start out hot and dry, scouting is going to be incredibly important to keeping track of what those populations are doing and when you should be best spraying, when you should be best treating those populations. There was one question on the Q&A on time of day to spray. Some of it depends on whether or not you're dealing with something that's going to be actively feeding at night. Evening is still probably the best time. You're going to see less volatilization. Temperatures will kind of drop back down a little bit at night, even in drought and warm conditions. Early morning is better than middle of the day. I mean, the hotter it is in a drought condition, the hotter it is, probably the less efficacy or the more efficacy you're going to lose from the application would probably be a general rule of thumb. If you spray in the evening and it's cooler and it may be, the relative humidity might not be as low, that material will persist for a longer period of time and may persist into the next day as well. So evening is probably best. Early morning is better than the rest of the day, than any time when it's going to be warm. So would you agree with that, Bruce?
I think so. And I think, yeah, one thing you have to consider too is that, you got to read the insecticide label because of pollinators. And sometimes
Sure.
in drought conditions, normally I don't see many honeybees in soybeans, but when it's really dry, they're a little desperate for food, and you'll see a few more honeybees in like a soybean crop than you normally would. So that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for the conversation here today. Thanks for joining us, Bruce, Seth, and Ian. For those of you in the audience, thank you again for attending the session here today. Thanks again to our sponsors, Minnesota Corn and Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Councils. We will be continuing the insect pest discussion into next week's program where we'll be focusing on corn insect pests. So have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you all next week.
Bye.
Bye.